Hello, everyone. This is your weather woman, meteorologist Amy Metz. Right now, in the middle of the screen, you see this blueness. That is the coronagraph. Part of this, where that white circle is where the sun actually is. And the blue around that blocks out a lot of that bright light that comes from the sun. But then you'll notice a burst. That's a coronal mass ejection that did leave the sun. And if you want to find out more about how that affects us here on Earth, besides aurora, which is in the forecast over here, then you can check out my group on Facebook called Space and Earth Weather. So with this, most specifically, as I'm getting into a forecast here for Earth and cyclones, I would point out that some of these flares can give disruptions to our GPS, our radio communications, satellite information. The yellows here, very mild for geomagnetic storming, which can increase lightning as well. I believe it's that playoff from one of the other, the flares plus the geomagnetic storming. So that would be charging in the ground. Geo means on the earth, and then the flares disrupt a lot of the ionosphere, the upper atmosphere. So in that case, we get charged particles both on the ground plus in the upper air. That can give us more lightning. And so along with that is cloud condensation nuclei. What we're looking at here is the infrared. So if I play this over the last 12 hours, you'll see there's big bursts of red here where there's a lot of torrential downpours. And in the coming day or two, with that coronal mass ejection that we just saw leaving the sun, coming toward Earth, that could increase our cloud condensation nuclei, which is just a big long word for saying stuff that can create clouds in the air. So with this, I wouldn't be surprised if there's a little bit more rain that ends up in the forecast beyond what has already been forecast. But here we're watching for an invest near Australia, and there already was a lot of flooding here. So Vanuatu, Solomon Islands in this area has had a lot of flooding. Fiji got a nice break over the last couple of weeks as far as serious floods go, but they're finally getting some more torrential downpours again. And on the global scale here, when it comes to sea surface temperatures, anything in the orange is where we could still have cyclones developing. So that's warm enough water that a cyclone could form if all the other things fall in line. And when we already do have one, I'll get into in just a bit over here, traveling toward Madagascar, similar to what we saw last week, but just a little stronger now this time. And then the invest area here that I'm getting more questions on right now would be something that, at least there's a lot of land around here. That sort of thing will disrupt the storms from forming. But one thing that is not in the destructive side, but then more so leaning toward this could continue forming stronger, is something called wind shear. So we have values that are low, 5s and 10s and greens is what meteorologists usually go off of to say that cyclonic formation is favorable. So we have the warm water, we have low wind shear, but then with some of this land here, as these storms try to circulate and form in the southern hemisphere going clockwise, if it starts hitting land and mountains and buildings, it will disrupt some of that circulation. So I don't believe this will get very strong, but definitely we all saw how much rain is out there around this particular storm. So there's still a lot of chance for more flooding coming up in the forecast. And then even stronger by Madagascar here. So a little further to the west is where we see another plume, and this one is over open waters. So it does have that chance to continue circulating and forming into something even stronger. So I'll go ahead and open up some of the data products for that as well, because again, it would be the shear that has the biggest, that's probably like the most important factor in ruining these cyclones is wind shear. So if we have wind at different levels going different directions, it will decrease it. So that's why this is forecast to get stronger through the area where there's no wind shear, and then kind of decrease a little bit after intersecting some of this wind shear. So I'll go ahead to my favorite thing here and look at the mid-level winds. And that's what I use a lot of times, around 500, 600 millibars, to decide where these storms will be moving toward. So at this moment, there's still a lot of air ahead of the one in Madagascar that's going northward, and that the storm itself is not forecast to go north anymore. And so I'm going to go up to 500 millibars and see if that's any different. And yes, it is a little different. Then you see that it's going a little bit more toward the west here. And so if this storm, based on what I'm seeing here, and the water temperature is another big one. I'll go back down to the surface for that. I would be saying, yes, a storm will want to go just the tiniest bit north before intersecting Madagascar. And then over here in the South Pacific, where we're seeing another storm forming, it's not as strong. Like I was talking about that friction and all the stuff here that's going to be bothering that, but it does have more rain with it. So flooding is going to be an issue in the southern hemisphere here still, and we did have a storm that bothered southern Australia with quite a bit of rain recently. And so I'm going to go ahead and play out this. Well, actually, first I'll look at the upper levels around. I'll call it the mid levels here, 500, 600 millibars, to see exactly how things are moving along. Now we don't even see the full circulation, just a little bit around that invest tells us one more time that it's not very strong. And so the way that it has been moving has been very slow, and I believe it will continue to be very slow, kind of linger in the same area where the water swarm keep on raining on Vanuatu, raining on Solomon Islands, and then finally make some changes toward Australia. So the last week that I got on here and did a live, this storm was a little bit more toward Vanuatu here. And if I go to the surface, you'll notice that it still is. So things don't move quickly there. That's my point there. If I go down to the surface and look at the wind gusts, we'll see that there is a storm, not a named storm, but it is south of here where I had told people last week that, yeah, this storm will probably be somewhere over here. It did stay back a little closer to New Caledonia, but my main point for that was that it was not going to be a bother to Fiji and minimal effects to New Zealand. So that does appear to still be the case. But then southern, so let's say southeastern Australia here is where we're going to be having more threats for some little bits of flooding as this storm continues moving that direction. So not very strong winds. There will be some coastal winds that are somewhat near tropical storm force with the gusts over New Zealand this week, but nothing very intense, nothing very damaging. And so if I go back to the satellite here, now a lot of this area doesn't have radar, so I'll just use the satellite to show you where it's raining instead. Some of this moisture will end up going southward with the storm, but you see here it's not as much as what we had last week when there was the other flooding here in southeastern Australia. So instead, we have quite a bit of flooding possibly here in northwestern Australia for this week. It's been raining quite a bit there, along with Solomon Islands and Vanuatu. So it is that time of year, and unfortunately, when the ground's already wet, it makes it easier for there to be mudslides. So Vanuatu is probably at a pretty high risk, even some of the Solomon Islands, for more of that type of flooding this coming week. So I hope everybody the best in that area. And then again, with Madagascar. So this last storm is still kind of lingering over West Africa now. It was bothering from the Republic of Congo all the way up here down to South Africa after crossing Madagascar, but not as strong as this next incoming storm. So anybody who was there through the last storm, just be aware that things will be a little bit more intense here with the next one as far as winds are concerned. And the rain has been lingering behind this storm. So while there will be torrential downpours before the strongest winds, the ongoing storms afterward, I believe, similar to what we're seeing here, will probably linger over most of Africa for quite a while. So we can be thankful that this is good for crops, but just be aware then during the passage of these storms, like where it is red right now and where there's topography, let's say hills and mountains and cliffs, that's where it will be the most dangerous. So if you need to be traveling anywhere or if you're out of your home, or even if your home is alongside of a waterway. These are the times that it could be a little more dangerous and waters can rise very quickly. When we see these reds and these blacks pop up into the screen, it's very much larger particles, is what the radar or the satellite actually is finding and then sending us back the information for. So the satellite in this case, where it's these darker reds, that's a lot of rain. And it's going to be lingering. So you'll have a little bit of a dry out in South Africa, Central Africa, but then behind it will be a stronger storm coming in a few days towards Madagascar. And so then let's say by about probably next week, Tuesday, is when you'll be getting even more rain to Africa a couple days ahead of that. So probably over the weekend to Madagascar and then cruising right into Africa. So be aware of that before it hits. Just as Australians have had to be more on guard with the flooding here, as this storm is still lingering. And as the week goes on, we will see this storm start to move away, and it will then be, I will be watching for what happens with the invest here. I don't believe this will be a named cyclone, just like the last one. I wasn't very confident that it would get a name or become a full-on cyclone, but there is a lot of information, like the sea surface temperatures and the low wind shear, that say this will continue to be stormy weather, thunder and lightning. And then again with that space weather that I showed at the beginning, these do tend to create more lightning when we have these flares. And this is a cycle, well, the part of the solar cycle that we're in would be leaning toward more and more of these. Sometimes we'll see that these lines stay pretty low in the A class, and then these C class flares tell us that the sun is a little bit more active with all these little bright spots. Those are basically storms on the sun. And so when they outburst, like we're seeing here with what's called a halo CME, it can bring some different weather at Earth. So you notice here, this is going crazy. This is a satellite out in space, and it starts to get a little messed up there as this particular solar storm blows past it. So it's an obvious example here as to how these solar storms can affect our communications and our, it's actually the parts inside the satellite that start to get overcharged and have different things go on with them, that maybe even it can move. These storms can just push the satellite, and that can also give different displays as to what it's capturing. And then there's another set of overcharging and different details that can get messed up inside of the satellite with information, where it can just lose information or maybe not send it back to the receivers on Earth the same way that it normally would. So that's another given, that this solar storm, did affect the satellite here. Luckily, it does appear to still be working. These weren't massive flares or massive solar storms, just enough that I would say we should be watching for more lightning. And so I'll put on this radar, even though, like I was telling you, there's not radar domes over here. So you're not going to see radar for everywhere. But where we do have storms and where there is radar, you'll see these circles. And inside of that, you can see the lightning that's going off with these storms. So that is quite a bit, and you can expect that to increase a little as that M-class flare that just passed. It was just barely over the threshold, with lots of C-class flares over the last week, and that kind of thing will boost up the lightning. So just understand that with these storms passing, lightning is a little bit bigger of a risk than I would say it normally is. So if it's going from the cloud all the way to the ground, that's when people could actually get shocked and struck by lightning. So be careful with this, as well as we're going ahead in the week with so many active storms in the southern hemisphere. And then up in the northern hemisphere, I'll just take a peek. We had a big, huge dumping of snow across the northeast with a nor'easter, as they're called. And I'm sitting here in the center working on, well, I'm working for a news station, just wishing that I could be forecasting some snow. But unfortunately, we're in a drought here in Iowa. So this is considered the heartland of America where there's a lot of farms in this area. And it's just been a very dry season here. So while there's some clouds overhead and some that have moved by, it just keeps drying out. And you'll notice that almost it just pretty much evaporates. So it's a bummer. This is called cold air advection when air comes from the north and moves to the south, especially with the temperatures that we've been having. This is cold air moving in, and that's not really a weather maker. So instead, it's when the air moves from the warm and goes to the cold that it condenses and gets these bright colors again and creates more and more clouds. So I wish that I could be forecasting we'll get out of this drought while I'm here. I'll be here for another 2 months. I'm just not certain that any of these big storms are going to hit us. I was forecasting little bits of snow flurries, but that the bulk of the snow would move to the south, and it does appear that way still. So I guess that pretty much does it for this cyclone forecast. There's not much out there and no questions. Yeah, these aren't very major storms right now, so I thought I'd just pop over there and see if there's any questions. The one major storm would be what's moving toward Madagascar. And again, this is kind of a mid-range cyclone, not the strongest winds. I'm talking more about like 100-mile-per-hour gusts, which can do some damage, especially up slopes. It will be stronger along this eastern portion of Madagascar where there's mountains and terrain. So I would recommend if you live along any slopes here, that it might be a nice night to figure out where else you can stay or stay in a lower level, somewhere that's protected by more walls, just in case that's if you live right next to some trees that perhaps be falling over in strong winds. So hopefully everybody can make it through these storms okay. And cyclone season is just about to reach its midpoint with the peak here in the southern hemisphere. And I'm hoping we can get by this year without any crazy major landfalls. So that's all for you today. This is your weather woman, meteorologist Amy Metz, wishing you a great day and awesome weather.